discuss in this presentation is reference point search or referencing when you apply it to the detection of caches, hides, and or potentially buried bodies. So first of all, if you've been on a management meeting, a leadership type course, or even at school, you may have experienced something which I'm going to describe now. So the instructor would have a fairly long, complex paragraph, which he would ask the first person within the room to read to themselves. He would then tell them to whisper the context and the contents of that paragraph to the person next to him. He would then tell that second person to whisper to the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and down the line, until eventually you get to the last person. And then invariably, when they ask the last person what was the contents of the instructions at the start, they wouldn't match. There would be parts missing or parts changed, and that would demonstrate how communication can be ineffective when one person passes complex instructions to another, to another, to another. And if we think about that when we think about referencing, then we can understand why the terrorist or criminal would use a much simpler system to actually communicate where there's a cache or a hide. So the terrorists and criminals tend to guide an accomplice to a hide location with simple to communicate instructions using a system called referencing. They may also utilize the system to remember where they concealed their contraband. And I've done that myself. I've learned many times when I've placed something out that I'm going to train the dog on, a target, and then I've gone and an hour later got my dog and come back to search for it, then I may not exactly remember where I've placed it. So I actually use this system in training every time I put something out. And whether that's photographing the prominent point, videoing it, drawing it, noting it, or just remembering it because it's something so obvious. But I do use this system in my training techniques, but also people do use this system if they're trying to conceal caches or hides, and they're either going to try and find it themselves or they're going to send someone else to find it. And this system of referencing relies on the selection of reference points. And a reference point will be a landmark or a feature on the ground that can be easily identified and located at night, even by someone who is not familiar with the area. And that is because the person that's hidden a cache or a hide isn't necessarily the same person that's going to recover it. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So let's first of all talk about three types of hide. The first one is long-term. This is often well constructed, maybe quite large because it holds a lot of resources. It's well concealed and it's well away from any target location, so it's less susceptible to search operations. I've seen examples of this being shipping containers buried in the ground or concrete bunkers. They're sometimes called doomsday hides or doomsday caches because they're well constructed, and the idea is that they're going to keep the content safe for a long period of time, months or even years. Next, we have the transit hide. This is usually closer to the planned incident, but may not be in the very near vicinity. And what happens is, let's say, for instance, there's going to be a shooting. A terrorist, normally somewhere in the quartermaster's department, would take out a weapon from the long-term hide and take it to the transit hide. And the transit hide might be designed specifically for that item. It might be designed specifically to hold a rifle just for that operation. It will be well concealed, so it will be hard to find, but it's not going to be as large or as well concealed as the long-term hide necessarily. And then there's the short-term hide. And this is within minutes of the incident, whether it's a bombing, a shooting, a drug sale, whatever it is. And this is going to be a fairly simple hide. It might be rapidly constructed. It could be something like a pallet with a tarp over, as long as it conceals the item, which can be quickly grabbed, used, and put back again. If it's a weapon or drugs that haven't been sold. Obviously, in the case of an IED, you won't expect it to be put back again. So here's a graphic of the types of hides and the movement from the long term to the transit to the short term, and in this case it's a hole in a tree, and then to the incident. Now, as I said, in the case of a rifle, a pistol, or maybe unused drugs or something like that, they might take that journey back again, or they likely will. Immediately after the incident, the item would be placed in the short-term hide. It'll then be recovered a little while later to the transit hide, and then move back to the long-term hide for actually longer-term storage. So at the scene of an incident, a shooter, in the case of the example of a rifle, would use the rifle, put it back in the short-term hide, and get out the area as quick as possible, remembering that there's witnesses, there's people that potentially describe that person. That person is also going to be contaminated with forensic evidence, so the cordite on their hands and clothing, or gun oil or something similar. So they're not going to want to spend a lot of time in that area with the weapon in their hands. They want to get rid of that and get out the area as quick as possible. And then sometime later, when things have calmed down, someone will go back, collect the weapon from the short-term hide, get it to the transit hide, and then a time later, it'll be recovered back to the long-term hide. So the reference points themselves tend to have certain characteristics. One of the primary ones is that they're permanent, such as a tree, a road junction, or a telegraph pole. A traffic cone or a car is not permanent because they can move, and as soon as they've moved, the whole integrity of the chain of reference points is lost. And you'll never find the cache if your primary marker is something that can be moved. So they're going to be permanent. Next, they are going to be prominent, so that can be seen at night and identified by someone who's never been in the area before. And as I spoke before, the shooter could potentially have nothing to do with the transit of the actual munitions and hide. In fact, it's very unlikely they have any idea where the transit or the long-term hides are. That is because if they are caught and they do crack under questioning, that the terrorist cell or the criminal cell doesn't lose all its resources because the gunman, who's in the high-risk position of actually being in the area of the incident, has been caught and spilled the beans and told them exactly where all the resources are stored. And then the last one is they are not too artificial, so they don't necessarily stand out as not fitting in the area. And I remember one time there was trash cans or rubbish bins attached to lampposts in a city street. And on one of the lampposts, there was two of these trash cans, one on top of each other, which was obviously artificial. It stood out as not being normal within that area. And sure enough, when there was a search conducted around that lamppost, a cache was located. So it's not going to be too artificial and draw attention to the actual location. So let's talk about the actual markers themselves. So the first one, the primary marker, this will stand out within the area. And you can see in this image, I've actually picked a telegraph pole. Because if we look into the area, it's the only telegraph pole. It's going to be easily to be seen at night. It's obviously permanent and it's not artificial to the area. There is other telegraph poles. You can see, I don't know, 100, 200 meters away. But that is the only one, and it is obvious. So I'm going to call that my primary marker. There would then be a secondary marker, and this is smaller, and it's going to be close to the primary marker, but less obvious. And in this case, I've used the corner of the wooden fence, and it's the post in the corner as my secondary marker. And then potentially there's going to be a tertiary marker or a third marker. And this one would be small, and you're not going to be able to find it unless you've been guided into the area from the secondary marker. And it might be something like a rock. And that rock is on top of the hide. So you remove the rock and underneath is the cache. Now, what we have to remember is that the hide can be located at any marker. It could be on the primary marker, and there isn't a secondary marker or even a tertiary marker. It could be that there's 4 markers that are used in the system, but just remember that communication chain I spoke about at the start and how it starts to fall down the more complex we make the instructions. So if you're going to find a primary marker, obviously you're going to search around that. You're going to look for secondary markers to search around them and tertiary markers. The main point here is to be search aware. That is, apply these principles within your target location, and you should be able to find the location of the cache or the hide. But just remember, even if the hide is empty, you are still going to gain intelligence from the hide itself. So it can be tested for contamination. It may contain evidence of what was held in it. There could be fingerprints. Even the container itself might have a barcode which points to where it was purchased or where it's from, or some sort of labeling or serial number. So even if the hide or cache is empty, there's still a potential that intelligence could be collected. So what I'm going to do now is show a video. And this video explains all the principles I've just spoke about and how it's applied into the field. Now that we've discussed some of the main concepts of referencing, let's look at that in a practical application. First of all, what you must consider is the fact that if you are going to conduct a buried cache search, that you would have been led here through some sort of intelligence. Whether someone has reported that they've seen unusual activity, maybe there's been lights at night, or that a terrorist or criminal has given up information which has pointed you into a certain area. Next, we must consider that everyone is an individual. So when I look ahead of me and start to pick out what I consider to be primary markers, another person might look ahead and not look at those same primary markers in their system of search. So when we move into an area, while we're doing our pre-search assessment and looking for primary, secondary and tertiary markers, what we must remember is that someone else might not consider them as the same types of markers. And for that reason, when we conduct the searches around any marker, we do so out to 15 meters. While we're conducting that search out to 15 meters from a reference point, we are then looking for any secondary and tertiary reference points and conducting a 15-meter search around them. Continually, as we move through the area, assessing for primary, secondary and tertiary markers of any type. So with the short-term cache, we know it's going to be there less than an hour. It's available for immediate use close to the actual incident location or drug sale, and then it's gone again. Another point to consider is access. So a terrorist or criminal doesn't necessarily want to have to walk 500 meters with a rifle over their shoulder or a bag of drugs. So generally it's going to be easy access, get in, get the goods and get out of there. Because this is a junction of 3 tracks, we don't know which way the person who's either burying or trying to locate the cache has come from. So therefore, again, you must make an assessment not based on the fact that I've approached from this direction, therefore the terrorist or the criminal will approach from this direction. We must make a consideration that they could approach from any direction, and therefore their line of sight into the area would be different from your initial line of sight. So we've arrived in our target location, we know our boundaries, we're going to discount any markers which are more than 10 meters, 30 feet outside of our boundary. So anything within that distance, we're going to start to assess as our primary, secondary and tertiary markers. We're also going to be looking for anything that's unusual, such as if we look at this white tape here. This is what we call man on nature. This white tape hasn't blown here and been caught in the fence, it's actually tied with a knot. So this shows us that there's been an interaction between humans and nature, hence man on nature. And that could be some sort of indicator that leads to a cache. So we're going to make note of that and use that during our search process to actually pinpoint locations. And in this case, if we look here, there's 2 manhole covers or water meter covers. So potentially I'm going to be looking at that as a possible cache location. Now remember, you have 3 types of hides: long-term, transit and short-term. With the long-term, that's generally going to be a larger hide, it's very well concealed, and it possibly isn't even going to be opened for months or even longer. With a transit hide, that's where munitions, drugs, etc. are being moved from a long-term hide to a short-term hide. And it's a location that isn't necessarily as well hidden as the long-term, but it certainly takes some search techniques to actually find it. And then we have the short-term hide. And with the short-term hide, the actual contraband would not stay in the location any more than 1 hour. So while these 2 covers here are obvious, they certainly could be used as a short-term hide location. Drugs, a weapon, anything that nature could be placed inside there, and they're easily recovered within the 1 hour. So again, when we're making our assessment, we are looking at what type of hide are we looking for. Does the intelligence point us towards a long-term, a transit or a short-term? So now let's concentrate on our primary marker, which in this case is going to be this telegraph pole. When I move into the area, what I want to do is place my back against this reference point and then move round in a 360-degree motion. And what I'm doing is looking ahead of me for secondary markers, other primary markers, so that I can start to build up a picture of what can I see from this location. Now, as I said initially, the telegraph pole is my primary reference point, but someone else could pick this 5-bar gate, or this oil pump, or the corner of the field. So again, we have to repeat that process with each of these reference points to ensure that we are capturing all the potential markers in this area. So if we give an example now, and I use the telegraph pole as my primary marker, I'm going to tell someone, go to the telegraph pole, stand with your back against the pole facing the woods. Now there's only one wood line here, so there's no question that they are going to face in the right direction. I then tell them, turn 90 degrees to your right, keeping your back against the telegraph pole. So now I know they're going to be facing in this direction, because as long as they know they're left to right and 90 degrees, they're going to turn exactly into the direction I said. So now I can say, look ahead and you will see a cut down telegraph pole. Walk toward that. So we're walking forward towards the cut down telegraph pole, and I can tell them, when you get to that telegraph pole, stop, put your back against the telegraph pole by turning 90 degrees to the left, and look ahead into the wood. Directly in front of you is a V-shaped tree, and at the base of that tree is your hide. So there's a primary marker, which is the large telegraph pole, a secondary marker, which is the smaller telegraph pole, and then a tertiary marker, a third marker, which is actually the V-shaped tree, and the hide would be located below that. Once we have conducted our pre-search assessment, we've checked the areas for the reference points, We've actually approached those reference points and done 360s and looked for any other markers, primary, secondary or tertiary markers. We've built up our search plan. Then we're going to work through the area. And in the case of the canine, the detection canine, we're going to conduct detailed searches around these markers, 15 meters, covering all the ground, and prioritizing locations that potentially could contain a cache or lead you to believe the area is productive, such as these water covers, base of fences, the oil pump, this pipe in here. All these are indicators that I need to bring my dog into this area and ensure the area is searched in depth. I'd like to give a shout out to my friend Chris. Chris assisted me in producing this video and reviewing it for accuracy. Chris is a former Royal Engineers Search Advisor, as well as the bomb disposal officer for some canine projects I was involved with, both for Iraq and the Balkans. Chris is now an independent contractor, and he is available for agencies and organizations to conduct search, technique, tactics and procedure training. If you need canines within that training, then Chris and I work very well together, and we can develop a training course specific for you. So please feel free to get in touch, either if you want to talk to Chris and or both Chris and I, to support your training needs. Thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar. I hope you found it interesting and that it provided you some information for future searches you might be conducting. You can go along to my website, www.chiron-canine.com, and there I will list future webinars as well as on my social media, Facebook and Instagram. So if you subscribe to them, you'll get the most up-to-date information on webinars that I'll be releasing. Some of them are going to be paid webinars and some of them are going to be free depending on the content. Thank you very much, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this webinar.